Hello and welcome. The Blues have got their first loss on the board, and this game had many takeaways and storylines. But separate from the shenanigans of the match itself is one interesting recent discussion. This is concerning Ollie Hollands and his recent form. Some people are absolutely crying out for him to get dropped, treat him like any other player out of form. Others are defending him like he's their own son. And there's so many questions surrounding his play. Has he been that bad, or is he picking up the pieces of his teammates and their mistakes? Let's take a deep dive. In order to know if Ollie is playing his role, we need to classify what his role actually is. In my view, a winger in the Carlton system needs to A, run for days, which leads to goal scoring opportunities, and B, contribute to structure. They also need to C, be physically able in the contest and win their one-on-ones. Now, seeing Ollie execute A is not exactly hard to do. The bloke ran 15 kilometers on the weekend, nearly 4 of those at high speed, was the fastest runner in attack, and within that, had many sprints and repeated sprint efforts. You'll see one of those efforts in the late game, which is heavily overshadowed by the blunder of Owies. Hollands finds himself getting too far under the footy here, but his work rate is absolutely ridiculous to try close out the clearing kick from the Owies failed attempt at goal. The kick is that bad that Jones has a head start, and thus it spurs on the Crows' transition to get to the other end of the ground without Carlton ever getting set up. But credit to Ollie for grafting and nearly getting to the kicker. However, sometimes Ollie's forward running can serve as a detriment, especially off turnover. Right here, the minute the Blues get a turnover, Ollie is already hell-bent on trying to beat his opponent the other way. However, the success of that is at the mercy of your teammates. Now, when the ball is turned over, there is all this space going back to goal, and Hollands has to make up the ground. Hollands never gets in front of his opponent to block that run to goal, and because he's forever trailing the play, it means he has no choice but to make a blind lunge at the man, knowing that if he doesn't, Jones will waltz into an open goal. This isn't necessarily his fault, it's more just the mindset serving as detrimental because of a turnover. Now, if you're going to run a lot, you need to present as an option. Link play up and support as the ball progresses down the field, being an option if your teammates run into trouble. Though in this aspect of the game, I don't think Ollie really shows a lot of assertion in terms of wanting that football. Like here, for example, it's most likely the right option here to go long. De Koning's matched up on Gallant. Cripps also has a height matchup that favours him. It's more just I'd like to see Ollie call for a block by Newman on his direct assignment and try get into this space. Try free up the space behind you, so maybe instead of a sideways run, Cripps can hook turn, move forward, and then De Koning doesn't have to crash a pack and get over the top. Maybe this mark is being taken in such a case. Here's an example of another winger doing exactly what I'm asking for. So Blake Acres first extends back, and this is on the open side wing, so plenty of space. Use that tank you've got at your disposal. Try lose your man and demand a kick in space. He has sucked the Adelaide player down the ground, so now he can sprint forward at the kicker. Then a few players are flooding over, so Acres sees this little spot here. Look, ideally you want the centre to be more accessible, so you trap yourself in a little bit in this pocket, but sometimes you need this option. Presents an option to buy more time, get it a bit further upfield, chew up some clock. That said, there were moments Ollie turned an inability into a superpower. Okay, maybe I'm overdoing it. But this here is quality by Ollie. Very subtle, but Ollie not leading into space means Boyd, who lost his man as a result of that player picking up Newman, can run into this space. You're getting the ball to an elite kicker, and it's simply because Ollie dragged his assignment away, meaning it's a no-brainer of an option that presents itself. Late in the quarter, gain as much territory as you can, don't concede a late one. In fact, this builds into what got Charlie his goal on the quarter time siren. Now, the next thing we have to analyse is structure. Ollie's important for structure because the wing position is very key in the structure. There's multiple considerations. He needs to hold his positioning well and be positioned for an involvement in a Blues switch. He needs to protect the widest parts of the ground. Further to this point, he needs to ensure there aren't easy back 50 exits for the opposition. Now, at stages, I thought this was far too easy for the opposition to exploit with Ollie on the wing. The Crows carved the Blues up from defensive 50 exits in terms of turning that into scores on their end, And here's one example of it. On the kick-in, you've got an opportunity to set up. Theoretically, you shouldn't have any sniff of getting it down the other end quickly, given you're usually kicking to a contest. Hollands is an important player in the mix because you lose the contest, give away a mark, now getting it to the other end quickly becomes something in the Crows' favour. For where the Crows man is, you should be aiming more so for a 50-50 here, where you can potentially cause a lockup. Though it almost catches you off guard for how easy it was. The closer the player is to their target, the less space you can afford the opposition. And so Ollie needed to be a little bit tighter. Does feel like there's also a bit of imbalance with the zone because Ollie is covering all this space when there should possibly be another blue packing it in. And so the kick out of the back 50 is incredibly easy for all these variables at play. However, some of the poor kick in defending and structural ineptitude that the Blues showed on this day was a byproduct of poor forward play. This is a shocker from a kick in that results in a Crows goal. So Harry Mackay and Orazio here don't get their shit together quickly enough. The way these Blues are distributed isn't very zone reminiscent. It's just leaving a bloke wide open right at the 50-metre strike. Orazio realistically should have sprinted across just to cover ground about here. Instead, because of where Orazio finds himself, Elijah Hollands has too much ground to make up. Now, Akers is covering two players essentially and comes forward to close off the shorter kick. But with that stand on the mark rule allowing Hinge to buy ground, the kick over the top is accessible. Kennedy leaves his man to try and impact, but it is too late, meaning McHenry is open over the top, which was Kennedy's man. He's the next kick in the chain, and with a bit of link up, they're inside 50 before you know it. You see where Akers was? On the open side, this wide. Usually you don't have too many, if any, tools contesting from the kick-in. So that's why wingers are so important. Basically in the whole sequence to the other end, Akers, whilst gut running, was basically getting passed by at every opportunity. Hollands isn't involved in this sequence, but this is how things went from kick-ins at times. And that lapse, simply from the setup by the forwards, essentially rendered the wingers useless in playing a part in defending the ground. This didn't just occur with regards to kick-ins. Lockie Fogarty was obviously out this game. He, this season, has averaged 5 tackles a game, 3 of those inside 50. On the weekend, Owies, Fantasia and Durden without him had a cracking 4 tackles, 3 of them inside 50. If 3 blokes aren't even breaking even with what your best pressure forward usually dishes up, you've got issues. I'll take an early game example so we can avoid the fatigue excuse. Owies was kicking inside 50. I have no idea where he is on the follow-up, and Durden's doubled back to the goal square. So you don't have the pressure forwards with a real sniff of having an impact. For all those Blues committed to a forward 50 entry, only to have to now get back, players like Hollands or any winger for that matter, don't have a sniff of being a part of a structure when the ball is moving like this. This was far too common. I do feel like Hollands had a mixed bag when it came to holding width. I found multiple occasions earlier on, Hollands was playing a bit too narrow and the opposition was playing with a ton of width. So the Crows were enabled into finding an outlet by going the long way round, and it did work as well. Here's an example of this working in close quarters. Hollands is drawn into the contest. Crows have numbers on this side of the contest. They can use that man Hollands left wider as a connecting piece to get right into the edge of the playing field and get the clearing kick on Brodie Smith's right dominant side. Sometimes this was off the back of poor play in the center of the park as well by the Blues when it came to defending the ground. Here's one where a kick by Saligo carves the Blues up. Hollands isn't involved in this, but it demonstrates how wingers had to cover at times, thus leaving their man out wide. I believe it's Boyd who left Walsh to cover in the middle, but with no impact and having left his man, it means that's an easy use for the Crows. Akers needs to move inward, meaning the space held on the outside can be maximised with an expansive handball. However, the Blues are lucky to not be on the wrong end of this. With switches when the Blues did and didn't have the ball, Ollie was decent, position-wise. Actually exploiting it? Not so much. Felt like Ollie was in situations where the Blues got nothing out of it, his fault or not. Simply put, there were some examples where he was proactive getting into the space, drawing players away, allowing others to come forward and create space for key forwards. However, there was some stuff you could not bear to watch from this standpoint. Here, the Crows play right into where the Blues are well covered, with a shocker of a kick as well. Bear in mind, they're down 16 points with about 7.5 minutes to go here. Now, this isn't entirely Ollie's fault because Harry is not on the same page. He's acting like he needs to cover space when he simply needs to remain glued to his man. The Crows potentially don't even risk the kick on the open side if it is anything else. It is a bit luck-based here because the ball drops perfectly to Nankervis, but for a 2-on-2, there should be zero reason an outnumber is created. The Crows play around the Blues and exploit the extra man because Harry's he's ended up in no man's land to say the least. And look, there is more luck-based stuff. For example, a fat gust of imaginary wind swerving the ball left to make it unmarkable, but that should have never happened to start with because it was a 2-on-2, absolutely shocking kick on top. You could anticipate where the ball was going. How did this result in a goal? Look, it wasn't helped with Harry's blunders, but would a more physical player have created a lockup as opposed to Ollie? I think this embodies a bold yet effective strategy by Michael Voss in the late game, which leads us into the contest/physical element of being a winger. Ollie wasn't really prevailing in these 50-50 one-out type situations in this game. And look, that isn't his strength by any means. But just look at these stats by Akers and Cottrell in the fourth. Now, I'll read Ollie's stats. 8 pressure acts. Yeah, that's it. Donuts everywhere else. Why? For starters, the game was not played on his side. Felt like a ploy by Voss to have Ollie on switch play duty and the stronger, physically able body on the side where the game was predominantly played. It also makes a ton of sense for the colossal last quarter Blake Acres had, where they were feeding him in the contest time and time again. Ollie wasn't awful by any means around stoppage in this game, but you feel the younger player is still garnering respect from his teammates. Tom de Koning at stages banged it on his boot, even if he had Hollands over his shoulder wide open. Meanwhile, Blake Acres was kicking goals, and they chucked him on Sam Berry at many stoppages in the late game, seeing Berry was the fresh legs, and Acres probably was the one most capable at that stage of the game in keeping up with him, given his tank and the lack of rotation. On top, you'll see him putting in massive efforts here, followed up by this effort, and then was used in the play to get it to that Cottrell-Hollands contest. I don't necessarily think this was an indictment of Ollie being hot garbage, more just a very situation-based tactical move, which I'd say was largely successful for the fourth quarter Blake Acres had. But it's worth noting that Ollie still, in those battles on the open side that he had in the fourth, he didn't reap anywhere near a return that was required when holding onto a slender lead. This is what Voss had to say about this.
When you get to the end of the game, and defence actually has to be the thing that stands up, as wasn't as robust as we needed it to be in the really big moments.
I just think that comment is interesting to consider when you factor in the roles Acres and Hollands were assigned in the fourth quarter. So overall, it is a mixed bag with Ollie Hollands. Whilst I do feel like he's leaving a lot on the table, I don't necessarily think that's been entirely his fault. I feel he sometimes falls victim to the system, but he plays a very important role within that system for the two-way running it requires and the structural elements it tends to. This game demonstrated inconsistency in playing that role, and that signals how he's generally been in 2024. Do the Blues have room for inconsistency given the slate of games coming up? I'll leave you to make that judgment. Are you Ollie in or Ollie out? Did his good offset the bad? Make sure to share your thoughts in the comments. I will be back next week for Carlton analysis post the GWS game, so make sure to drop in. Until then, have a cracking rest of your day, stay safe, and bye for now.